In the spring of 1945, a Japanese soldier named Hiroo Onoda crouched in the jungle of Lubang Island in the Philippines, cleaning his rifle with a piece of oiled cloth. The war had been over for months. Tokyo lay in ruins. The emperor had spoken the unthinkable words of surrender over crackling radio waves that August. But Onoda did not know this, or perhaps more accurately, he could not believe it. For 29 more years, he would wage a one-man war against an enemy that had gone home, against a nation that had moved on, against a reality he had been trained never to accept. His story is extreme, but the impulse behind it, the refusal to surrender, even when defeat is certain, runs like a wire through the final year of the Pacific War. From the caves of Iwo Jima to the hills of Okinawa, from the desperate kamikaze pilots over the Philippine sea to the hollow-eyed garrison troops on bypassed islands eating grass and bark, Japanese soldiers fought with a ferocity that mystified and horrified their American adversaries. They fought when supply lines were cut. They fought when reinforcements would never come. They fought when the strategic situation was hopeless and the outcome mathematically determined. The question is not whether they fought. The body counts and medal citations answer that, but why? Understanding this requires stepping outside the comfortable myths both sides told themselves. It was not simple fanaticism, though that word was used liberally in Allied intelligence briefs and war bond posters. It was not a death wish, though death was often the result. It was a convergence of culture, indoctrination, fear, loyalty, and a military system that had spent decades engineering men into instruments that could not bend, only break. To grasp why Japanese soldiers fought when the war was lost, we must first understand what they believed they were fighting for, what they had been taught to fear more than death, and how an entire nation convinced itself that surrender was not merely disgrace, but extinction of the soul. In February 1945, the island of Iwo Jima was a black smear of volcanic ash in the middle of the Pacific. 8 square miles of sulfur stink and worthless rock that mattered only because B-29s needed it as an emergency strip on the long haul to Tokyo. The American planners estimated it would take 4 days to secure. The Japanese commander, Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kurobayashi, had spent months turning the island into a honeycomb of tunnels, pillboxes, and interlocking fire zones. He told his men they would not win. He told them reinforcements would not come. He told them each man was expected to kill 10 Americans before dying. 21,000 Japanese defenders faced an American invasion force of over 70,000 Marines. The arithmetic was never in doubt. And yet, when the Marines hit the beach on February 19th, they walked into a killing field that would not relent for 36 days. Kurobayashi had forbidden banzai charges, the wild, suicidal human wave attacks that had characterized earlier island battles. Instead, his men fought from prepared positions, withdrew through tunnels when overrun, and reappeared behind American lines. They bled the Marines for every yard. Flamethrower teams had to scour each cave. Artillery had to pulverize each bunker. When it was over, nearly 7,000 Americans were dead and 19,000 wounded. Of the Japanese garrison, only about 200 were taken prisoner. The rest died in place or took their own lives in the final days. Kurobayashi himself was last seen leading a final night attack with a samurai sword, his body never found. This was not mindless fanaticism. Kurobayashi was a pragmatic officer who had traveled to America before the war and understood its industrial might. He knew Japan could not win. His letters home to his family were tender and reflective, full of cherry blossoms and longing. But he also knew his duty as defined by the code that had shaped him since childhood: to delay the enemy, to make victory so costly that perhaps, impossibly, the Americans might negotiate rather than invade the home islands. It was a doomed calculus, but it was a calculus. And beneath it lay something deeper, an identity so fused with obedience and honor that the concept of individual survival became not just unthinkable, but meaningless. To understand that fusion, we must go back decades, to the classrooms and parade grounds where boys learned what it meant to be Japanese in an age of empire. The Meiji Restoration had transformed Japan from a feudal society into a modern military power in a single generation. But it had done so by weaponizing old samurai virtues and wedding them to industrial-age nationalism. Bushido, the way of the warrior, was revived, sanitized, and taught in schools as a civic religion. Loyalty to the emperor was absolute. Death in service was the highest honor. Surrender was not merely defeat. It was spiritual pollution, a stain that could never be washed away, and that dishonored not just the individual but his family, his village, his ancestors stretching back generations. This was reinforced through a military training system designed to break and rebuild. New conscripts were subjected to ritual beatings, public humiliation, and psychological conditioning that erased the boundary between self and unit. Officers carried out summary executions for infractions. Disobedience was treason. Compassion was weakness. The 1941 Japanese Army Field Manual, the Senjinkan, laid it out in plain terms. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die, and leave no ignominious crime behind you. Surrender was not an option on the menu. The menu itself had been taken away. By 1945, this indoctrination had created armies of men for whom continued resistance, even in the face of certain death, was not a choice but an inevitability. A young private on a nameless Pacific atoll did not weigh his tactical options. He had been conditioned, for years, to see only one path. And that conditioning was reinforced by fear, not just of the enemy, but of his own side. The stories that Japanese soldiers told each other about what would happen if they surrendered were not based on propaganda alone. They were rooted in experience, memory, and a cultural understanding of what defeat had meant throughout history. In the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, Japanese prisoners had been treated reasonably well by the Russians, but when they returned home after the war, they were often shunned, unable to find work or marry. The stigma was generational. Fathers who had surrendered raised sons who bore the weight of that shame. By the 1930s, as Japan's military expanded into China and Southeast Asia, the message had hardened. Capture was not survival, it was erasure. This belief was amplified by what Japanese soldiers had themselves done to enemy prisoners. The Imperial Japanese Army's treatment of Chinese civilians and POCs, the Bataan Death March, the systematic abuse in camps across the co-prosperity sphere, these were not secrets. Soldiers knew. And from that knowing came a terrible mirror logic. If we do this to them, what will they do to us? Allied leaflets dropped over Japanese positions offering safe passage and hot meals were often ignored not because they were disbelieved, but because accepting them required a psychological leap the average soldier had been trained, punished, and shamed into never making. On Saipan, in the summer of 1944, this fear manifested in one of the war's most haunting episodes. As American forces closed in on the island's northern cliffs, Japanese civilians, men, women, children began throwing themselves into the sea. Mothers clutched infants and stepped off the rock. Families formed circles and detonated grenades. American soldiers and interpreters shouted assurances through bullhorns, waved white flags, but the people kept jumping. They had been told the Americans would torture them, rape the women, murder the children. Some of that messaging came from military authorities. Some came from a deeper cultural dread of foreign occupation, shaped by centuries of isolation and the recent memory of Western imperialism carving up Asia. The cliffs came to be called Banzai Cliff and Suicide Cliff, and the footage shot by American combat cameramen blurred. Figures falling in silence became some of the war's most disturbing images. For the soldiers, the lesson was clear. If civilians chose death over capture, what hope was there for a warrior? The propaganda posters showed Americans as demons with fangs. The officers gave speeches about sacred duty. But underneath, quieter and more powerful, was the knowledge that to surrender was to stop being Japanese in any way that mattered. It was to become a ghost. This was not uniform. There were men who wanted to live, who hid in caves and waited for the fighting to stop, who eventually stumbled out with hands raised. But there were exceptions, and their stories were rarely told back home. What was told, what was celebrated, were the last stands. The kamikaze pilots who flew their Zeros into carrier decks. The infantry companies that held a ridgeline until the last man bled out. The sailors who stayed at their posts as their ships capsized. These were the models. These were the men whose photographs appeared in newspapers, whose families received ceremonial swords and imperial commendations. And so, as 1945 ground on and Japan's strategic position collapsed, the soldiers dug in deeper. On Peleliu, a tiny coral island that was supposed to fall in days, the Japanese commander Kunio Nakagawa orchestrated a defense in depth that cost the Americans over 10,000 casualties across 2 months of close-quarters cave fighting. Nakagawa's final radio message to Tokyo was simple: "Our sword is broken and our spear is shattered." Then silence. He and his remaining men conducted a last charge and were annihilated. Not because they thought they could win, because the alternative, walking out with hands up, had been made unimaginable. The same pattern repeated on Okinawa, the bloodiest ground battle of the Pacific. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Oshijima commanded over 100,000 troops in a defense that turned the island's ridges and tombs into a 3-month meat grinder. Oshijima was a thoughtful, educated officer who understood the war was lost. His diary entries reveal a man conflicted, exhausted, and resigned. But he followed his orders: bleed the Americans, delay the invasion of Japan, buy time for the homeland to prepare. When the end came in June, Ushijima and his chief of staff committed ritual suicide overlooking the sea. Their deaths were formalized, ceremonial, a final refusal to yield even the symbolic ground of their own bodies. But perhaps nowhere was the ideology of fighting to the death more starkly embodied than in the kamikaze program. Starting in late 1944, as Japan's trained pilots and serviceable aircraft dwindled, the High Command began organizing suicide attacks on a systematic scale. Young men, many of them university students hastily trained in obsolete planes, were sent on one-way missions to crash into American ships. The word kamikaze divine wind invoked the typhoons that had scattered Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, casting these pilots as instruments of miraculous salvation. The reality was more complicated. Some volunteers were genuine believers, swept up in the romance of sacrifice and the promise of eternal honor at Yasukuni Shrine. Others were subjected to intense peer pressure, officers asking for volunteers in front of assembled units, where refusing meant public humiliation. And some simply calculated that death in a kamikaze dive was no worse than death in conventional combat, and at least this way their families would be honored. Letters written the night before missions reveal the spectrum. Some are exalted, poetic, full of cherry blossoms and emperor worship. Others are quietly terrified, barely concealing doubt beneath ritual phrases. What united them was the understanding that the mission was terminal. Unlike conventional pilots who might bail out or ditch and survive, kamikaze crews had their canopies welded shut in some cases, or were given just enough fuel for a one-way trip. The aircraft were often stripped of armor and guns, packed instead with explosives. The young men were dressed in ceremonial headbands, given a final meal, handed a last cup of sake. Then they climbed into the cockpit and became a guided missile. Over the course of the war, kamikaze attacks sank dozens of ships and damaged hundreds more, but at a cost of nearly 4,000 pilots. The strategic impact was real, but diminishing American radar and fighter screens improved, and the loss of experienced aviators hollowed out Japan's remaining air capacity. Yet the program continued, even expanded, into the final months. Because by then, the logic of the war had stopped being about victory and become about legacy. Japanese leaders spoke openly of the 100 million dying with honor rather than living in defeat. The phrase was Ichioku Gyokusai, the shattering of the 100 million like a jewel. It was apocalyptic, but it was also a kind of consolation. If the nation could not win, at least it could die in a way that future generations, hypothetical, imagined, would remember as noble. But not every soldier was a believer. As the war ground into its final desperate year, cracks appeared in the monolith. Desertion, while rare and savagely punished, did happen. On remote islands, small groups of men slipped away from their units, hid in the jungle, and survived on foraged food, hoping the Americans would simply bypass them. Some did. Dozens of Pacific islands were declared secure, while hundreds or even thousands of Japanese holdouts remained, scattered and starving. Over the following months and years, they trickled out skeletal, disoriented, sometimes decades later. Their reintegration into Japanese society was awkward and often silent. They had survived, but they carried the stain. The soldiers who stayed and fought were not always motivated by ideology. Many were simply trapped. The Japanese military's logistical collapse meant that by mid-1945, entire garrisons were cut off from resupply. They could not retreat, there was nowhere to go. They could not be evacuated, the navy was shattered, the merchant fleet sunk, surrender was forbidden. So they stayed and starved. On islands like Bougainville and New Guinea, disease and malnutrition killed more men than combat. Units disintegrated into isolated groups foraging for roots and rats, barely coherent as fighting forces. When the end came, many were too weak to resist. They sat in their bunkers and waited, not for victory or death in battle, but simply for the waiting to stop. In those final months, the Japanese High Command knew the war was over. Intercepts showed American intelligence reading their codes. The firebombing of Tokyo and other cities had destroyed much of Japan's urban industrial base. The blockade had strangled imports. The USSR was preparing to enter the war. And yet, the government could not bring itself to say the word surrender. Instead, they spoke of seeking more favorable terms, of holding out for a negotiated peace that would preserve the imperial system and avoid occupation. This was fantasy, and many in the Japanese leadership knew it, but the alternative unconditional surrender was an admission that the entire ideology, the entire war, had been for nothing. And so the soldiers were asked to keep fighting, not for victory, but for leverage. The plan was called Ketsugo, the decisive homeland operation. If the Americans invaded the main islands, the military would mobilize every able-bodied man, woman, and older child. Bamboo spears were distributed. Civilians were drilled in suicide tactics. The objective was not to win, but to make an invasion so costly that the Americans would balk. It was Iwo Jima and Okinawa logic extended to an entire nation. Millions would die, but perhaps that collective sacrifice would secure terms that allowed Japan to die on its feet rather than live on its knees. This mindset helps explain why so many soldiers fought savagely, even in battles that had no strategic meaning. On Iwo Jima, the island's capture meant American fighters could escort bombers to Japan and damaged B-29s could land safely. That was real. But on countless bypassed atolls, Japanese garrisons fought off starvation and the occasional American patrol for no reason except that they had been ordered to hold, and they had been trained never to question. The American strategy of island hopping left these men behind irrelevant, but they did not feel irrelevant. They felt dutiful. One of the sharpest illustrations of this loyalty comes from the final days on Okinawa. As American forces tightened their grip, small units of Japanese soldiers conducted night raids, not to reclaim lost ground, but to die in a manner that fit the code. These were not banzai charges in the Hollywood sense, they were planned. Methodical infiltrations targeting supply dumps, communication lines, or isolated positions. The goal was disruption and honor, not survival. Men carried satchel charges and advanced until cut down. Wounded soldiers crawled forward with grenades. It was tactical only in the loosest sense. It was ritual made manifest, the acting out of an identity that had no room for surrender. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the debate over how to end the war dragged on. The military faction argued for Ketsugo. The emperor's advisors whispered about peace. The firebombing continued. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union invaded Manchuria. And still, the soldiers in the field knew only what their officers told them: fight, hold, die if necessary. The emperor's radio address on August 15th, announcing Japan's acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, was couched in euphemism and classical language so opaque that many listeners did not understand it was a surrender. Some officers refused to believe it. Some ordered their men to ignore it. And in distant jungles and fortified caves, men like Hiroo Onoda never heard it at all. For those who did hear and understand, the psychological shock was immense. The emperor's voice, never before broadcast, semi-divine, scratchy, and uncertain over the radio, told them to endure the unendurable. For soldiers who had been conditioned to see surrender as moral death, the command to lay down arms was not relief, but vertigo. Some wept. Some burned their uniforms and walked into the sea. Some turned their rifles on themselves rather than face a world in which everything they had believed was proven false. Others simply sat in silence, numb, unable to process that the war they had been told was sacred and eternal had ended not with a final glorious stand, but with a bureaucrat's signature on a piece of paper aboard a battleship in Tokyo Bay. The formal surrender ceremony on September 2nd, 1945, was brief and clinical. General Douglas MacArthur accepted Japan's capitulation while rows of allied officers looked on. Japanese representatives signed in silence, their faces masks. And across the Pacific, on 1,000 islands and in 100 scattered outposts, soldiers began the slow, uncertain process of becoming something other than what they had been made to be. But for some, that process never completed. Hiroo Onoda remained in the jungle of Lubang Island, conducting reconnaissance, sabotaging local infrastructure, and occasionally exchanging fire with Philippine police, convinced the war continued. Leaflets dropped by aircraft told him to surrender. He assumed they were enemy propaganda. Search parties called his name. He believed it was a trap. His last remaining comrade was killed in a firefight in 1972. Still Onoda stayed. Finally, in 1974, a Japanese explorer named Norio Suzuki tracked him down and showed him newspapers, photographs, proof. Onoda refused to believe. He said he would only surrender if his commanding officer personally ordered it. The Japanese government located Onoda's former superior, now a bookseller, and flew him to the Philippines. Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, elderly and bewildered, walked into the jungle in his old uniform and read the order aloud. "The war is over. You are relieved of duty." Onoda saluted, handed over his sword and rifle still oiled, still functional, and walked out after 29 years. He returned to Japan a celebrity, but he was not celebrated in the way the kamikaze pilots had been. He was a curiosity, an anachronism, a man who had taken the code so seriously that he could not let it go even when the nation had. His story became a parable, though of what exactly was never clear. Loyalty? Obsession? The cost of indoctrination so thorough it could outlast the regime that imposed it? Onoda was extreme, but he was not alone. Dozens of holdouts emerged over the decades, the last known surrendering in 1980. Each had a different story. Some never heard about the surrender. Some doubted it. Some simply could not imagine a life outside the war. They had become soldiers so completely that when the war ended, they did not know how to stop. This phenomenon reveals the deepest answer to why Japanese soldiers fought when the war was lost. They fought because the mechanisms that made them soldiers, cultural, psychological, institutional, did not have an off switch. Surrender required an act of imagination, a belief that life after dishonor was possible, that the self could be reconstituted outside the structure of duty and hierarchy and sacrifice. For men trained from childhood that their worth was inseparable from their obedience, that leap was often impossible. So they fought. Not because they were stupid or brainwashed in the crude sense, but because the architecture of their identity left no room for the alternative. After the war, Japan underwent a rapid and disorienting transformation. The American occupation dismantled the military, rewrote the constitution, and promoted democracy and pacifism. The emperor remained, but was stripped of divinity. War criminals were tried. Yasukuni Shrine, where the war dead were enshrined as kami, became a site of controversy. The generation that had fought struggled to reconcile what they had been taught with what they had experienced. Many never spoke of the war. The silence became a kind of national trauma, inherited by children and grandchildren who grew up in prosperity but shadowed by questions their parents would not answer. The soldiers who had fought to the last were honored in some circles, quietly mourned in others, and rarely examined with full honesty. The kamikaze pilots became symbols manipulated by both the left and the right, proof of noble sacrifice or of state-manufactured tragedy, depending on the politics of the speaker. The holdouts like Onoda were treated with a mixture of respect and embarrassment. They had done what they were told, and that fidelity had made them strangers in their own country. Understanding why Japanese soldiers fought when the war was lost does not mean excusing the atrocities committed in that war's name, nor romanticizing their sacrifice. It means recognizing the system's cultural, ideological, and coercive that turned young men into instruments of a doomed cause. It means acknowledging that loyalty, courage, and discipline are not inherently virtuous. They can be weaponized. It means seeing that the same training that produced soldiers who would hold a worthless island until death also produced men who participated in massacres, who brutalized prisoners who believed the suffering they inflicted was justified by the cause they served. The final lesson of why they fought is not about Japan alone. It is about what happens when a state fuses identity with obedience, when dissent is crushed, when honor is defined so narrowly that death becomes preferable to questioning. It is a warning, written in ash and coral, and the bones of men who were never given the chance to choose differently. On a quiet morning in 1974, Hiroo Onoda stood on the tarmac at Manila Airport, still gaunt, still wary, about to board a plane that would carry him back to a Japan he had never really known. A reporter asked him if he regretted the decades in the jungle. Onoda paused. He said he had been following orders. He said he had done his duty. He did not say he regretted it. He did not say he was proud. He simply looked past the camera, as if searching for something that had been left behind in the trees, and then he turned and walked toward the aircraft. The war had ended 30 years earlier. But for Onoda, and for the thousands of men who fought when fighting no longer made sense, the war had never really ended. It had only changed shape, becoming a memory, a question, a weight carried in silence. And in that silence we can still hear the echo of young men in caves and cockpits asked to die for a cause that could not be saved, and who died because they had been made to believe there was no other way to be. If you want to understand the wars we study, subscribe. There are no easy answers in history, only the difficult work of looking closely, listening carefully, and refusing to let the past be simpler than it was.